Okay, Daniel Payne is the owner of Dan's NRL Collectibles, which boasts 40,000 individual items of rugby league memorabilia. He is the author of 6 rugby league books, 2 of which have completely sold out. 3 of his books are part of the Rugby League's Heroes of Yesterday series. He's here to talk about his journey today of interviewing the most amazing rugby players whose stories are published in these books. Would you please join me in welcoming to the State Library of New South Wales, Daniel Payne.
Thanks for the very kind introduction, and I don't think I'll be doing all the prowling around that you were just explaining. Thanks, Jane, for putting me straight after that. Yeah. So, and also I'd like to thank Jane for organising this event for us to talk at the New South Wales Library. It's very special. So, who used to play footy in the backyard? Anyone here? So, a mate and I used to play rugby league footy in the backyard, just on the grass. And he was a mad Rooster supporter and I was an Eel. He would pretend that he was Kevin Hastings and I'd pretend that I was Brett Kenny. We didn't know much about the players then, except for what little we saw on TV or in some magazines. A lot of my fondest memories growing up were from the greatest game of all, rugby league. Another question, who can remember something very clear from when they were in kindergarten? Oh, there's a few. I can remember something crystal clear because it was the first ever time I saw footy cards. So my mum took me to a school fete, and on this rickety old table, there was a pile of Scanlon's bubblegum cards. And the top card was a Cronulla Sharks player. They were encased in a rubber band. And I think Mum noticed that I was curious and bought me the cards. Fast forward to when I was in year 7, and this another kid brought in a pile of football cards from the 1960s and 1970s. I didn't even know they had football cards in the 60s and 70s. I was quite excited, but I didn't want to show it, and it was the start of my business career. We came to an agreement after some negotiation, and I would give this boy $2, which was my lunch money, and he would give me the pile of footy cards. And we did this nearly every school day. The boy would take off and buy Winfield cigarettes and smoke them behind the schoolyard. And I often wondered whether he copped a hiding from his father for stealing these cards that were his father's to fund a cigarette habit. But I used to get home from school in those days and I was absolutely starving because I didn't have any lunch because I gave my lunch money for these cardboard footy cards. But it was worth it because my football card collection was growing. One afternoon I was walking back from school with a friend and I had a pile of cards which I just got from this kid. I was sort of flicking through and we got attacked by these 5 or 6 kids. And there were punches and kicks and I got flung back into a puddle. The footy cards flung everywhere and my peripheral vision, I saw my mate just run off and leave me there to cop it. And getting that beating wasn't as bad as actually seeing my footy cards flung all over the grass. And I was fascinated with the footy cards. They sort of transported me to another time and another dimension. There were guys with these great big handlebar moustaches. And there were action shots and I remember this guy, Dennis Mantiot, I'd never heard of him before. But his footy card was of him just about to punch this guy right on the face. Fast forward again to when I was an adult. In 2008, I published my first book. And in 2012, I published a revised edition of the book. And I also did a limited edition hardcover, which sold out completely within a month of its release. And I've been running a successful rugby league memorabilia shop for 20 years now. It's Dan's NRL Collectibles, as it was mentioned earlier. And I always try to think of a different way to attract customers or people to my shop. And one afternoon I was sitting with my son and we're reading an old Big League magazine, and we came to a player profile interview. And I asked my son, Kurt, if he thought it would be a good idea to put these interviews in my website, and that way people come in and they can read the interviews. And he thought it was a good idea. So I interviewed Bruiser Clark, Western Suburbs Magpies legend, very large guy. His interview was short and sweet, but I was away with my interviews of rugby league legends. I ended up interviewing 50 ex-rugby league players, first graders, and a lot of these guys I used to trade their bubblegum cards when I was a kid. And I became quite good at interviewing. It's quite simple, really. Some of the rules is just to shut up, listen and probe, and get them talking. Then I was going up to Newcastle to interview Robbie O'Davis. He's a real superstar. Won 2 grand finals for Newcastle, and he won man of the match in one of those. Played many games in State of Origin series for Queensland and many games for Australia. So I was quite interested with the upcoming interview, talking about his football career. But what I didn't expect was when he told me about Ronald McDonald House. Robbie told me that the highlight of his career was visiting the sick kids at Ronald McDonald House. There was a young boy, John, and he was painting his face, and John painted his face. It was getting quite late, and they both fell asleep, and actually, Robbie O'Davis fell asleep like this on the boys' sheets. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, he got a tap on the shoulder, and it was John's mother, and she said, "He's still here." And he sort of removed himself from the sheet and looked down, and his face imprint was in the sheets, and he's apologised and went home. 7 in the morning, he got a phone call that John had died during the night. And probably the most touching part was Robbie told me that they used that sheet with the face imprint to cover the coffin. I remember on that drive home, I thought these stories deserved to be told, whether sad or humorous, mostly humorous. They need to be told in books. And it was in this moment that my trilogy of Rugby League Heroes Yesterday's books was born. During the 1960s, 70s, 80s, all that era, rugby league was a very tribal and sometimes brutal sport. The game was full of characters, and that's something that's missing today. The stories from these characters, they could fill an abyss. They're very colourful. And while I just shared a sad story, some of the funniest stories I've ever heard are in these books. Billy Smith. Someone asked me about him earlier, but I think he's gone. Oh, there he is. St. George legend, 60s and 70s. And Penfolds were the major sponsor of the club, St. George Dragons. And they were having an end-of-year function at one of the wineries. After a few libations, Billy Smith decided to borrow the Penfolds bus. And he drove it out of sight behind a dam. He got out of the bus and he jumped into the dam fully clothed. And he walked back up to the party. Dripping wet, he's entered the party again and told everyone that he drove the bus into the dam, which he hadn't. But the officials weren't happy and they sacked him. All the time, Ross Harrington got sent to the sin bin by the ref. And while he's in the sin bin, one of the guys from the crowd has just passed him a schooner of beer. And he's had it. He had 2 schooners of beer while he was in the sin bin, and then he went back out and finished off the match. But I could go on and on with these stories, but I'd like to sign off echoing the words of Balmain and Australian legend Gary Jack. Now, Gary Jack recently suffered a cardiac arrest and almost lost his life, and he cherishes every moment. And Gary said to me, when people pass away, their stories are gone forever. But when people like me capture these stories and put them in these books, the stories live on forever and they become a part of history. So if you want to own your own piece of history, just buy one of my books. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. And I think, to be honest, the NRL owes a great debt of gratitude to people like you who actually take the time to put such a collection together of those stories and that history of the sport in Australia.